They called it the Golden Cage. As the truck rumbled down the dusty road that cut through endless fields of corn and wheat stretching to the horizon, Feldwebel Hans Müller pressed his face against the slats of the Army transport vehicle. The morning sun illuminated the landscape in a golden haze that seemed to mock everything he had been told about America. This wasn't the decadent, failing democracy on the brink of collapse that Nazi propaganda had promised. This was something far more terrifying to a soldier who had watched his comrades starve on the Eastern Front, a land of such agricultural abundance that it seemed to belong to another world entirely. "It can't be real," whispered the young infantryman beside him. "There's more food growing here than I've seen in my entire life." Before we dive into this extraordinary story, tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from? It's incredible to see our historical community spread across the world. And if you're new here, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Each subscription helps us continue unearthing these fascinating stories that shaped our world. Now, let's get to the story. It was the summer of 1943, and Hans Müller was one of approximately 372,000 German prisoners of war who would be held in the United States during World War II. For these men, capture represented not just military defeat, but an unexpected journey into the heart of the enemy nation. What they discovered there would fundamentally challenge everything they had been led to believe about America, capitalism, democracy, and the very war they had been fighting. The vast agricultural landscape that greeted them revealed America's true secret weapon. Not its tanks or planes, but its seemingly limitless ability to produce food. The American farmland represented something that Nazi Germany, with its desperate food shortages and rationing, could never match. It was a weapon of production rather than destruction, and its impact on the German POWs would prove more lasting than any artillery barrage. This is the largely forgotten story of how America's heartland became an unexpected battleground for the hearts and minds of Hitler's soldiers. The capture of German soldiers began in earnest following the North African Campaign in 1943, when Allied forces under General Eisenhower defeated the Afrika Korps. The British prison camps were already overflowing, and the logistics of feeding and housing tens of thousands of additional prisoners seemed insurmountable. The solution was both pragmatic and surprising: ship the prisoners across the Atlantic to America, where food was plentiful and escape back to German lines was impossible. The first substantial groups of German POWs arrived on American shores in 1943, often disembarking at ports like Norfolk, Virginia, or New York. Their arrival was kept relatively quiet. The American government was concerned about potential negative public reaction to enemy soldiers being housed on U.S. soil. The Geneva Convention required prisoners to be held in similar climate conditions to where they were captured. So many Afrika Korps veterans found themselves in camps across the American South and Southwest. For the majority of these prisoners, their journey didn't end at coastal processing centers. They were loaded onto trains and transported deep into the American interior to hastily constructed camps, often built near small rural towns across the heartland. The military had specifically chosen these locations not just for security reasons, but because they were agricultural centers desperately short of labor, as millions of American men had gone to war. By 1943, America was facing a critical labor shortage on its farms. With nearly 16 million Americans in military service and wartime industry booming, the country's agricultural regions were struggling to harvest the crops needed to feed both America and its allies. The solution seemed obvious to practical-minded officials: put the prisoners to work in the fields. The decision to employ German POWs as agricultural workers was not without controversy. Some Americans worried about coddling the enemy or potential sabotage. Others feared the psychological impact on communities that would now have to interact with men who, until recently, had been shooting at their sons and husbands. Yet economic necessity prevailed, and soon German prisoners were being transported daily from their camps to nearby farms orchards, and canneries. For the prisoners themselves, this first close encounter with the American agricultural system was nothing short of revelatory. Hans Müller had grown up in rural Bavaria, where small family farms struggled to produce enough food even in peacetime. Like many German soldiers, he had experienced severe food shortages on the front lines, particularly in Russia, where soldiers often survived on minimal rations supplemented by whatever they could scavenge or confiscate from local populations. The first day they took us to work on a wheat farm in Kansas, recalled former POW Gunnar Schmidt in a 1975 interview, I thought it must be some kind of exhibition set up to impress us. No real country could have fields that stretched beyond what the eye could see, all planted with food. But day after day, we went to different farms, and it was all the same, food growing everywhere, in quantities I couldn't comprehend. For many Germans, this agricultural abundance directly contradicted Nazi propaganda, which had portrayed America as a failing society where people stood in bread lines. During the Depression, there had indeed been food shortages and distribution problems in America, images of which were heavily utilized in German propaganda. But by 1943, American agricultural production had reached historic highs. The prisoners were witnessing not deprivation, but the most productive agricultural system in the world, operating at the peak of its capacity. This contrast between expectation and reality created significant cognitive dissonance. German POW Heinz Decker wrote in his diary, "If they can grow this much food while fighting a world war, how could we ever hope to defeat them?" The strategic implications are devastating. A nation that can feed itself this abundantly while sending millions of men overseas cannot be starved into submission, as our leaders suggested. The interaction between German POWs and American farmers created an unexpected dynamic. Many farmers were initially hesitant to work alongside the enemy, but pragmatic necessity soon gave way to more complex relationships. Agricultural work required close daily interaction, and over time, many farmers came to evaluate the prisoners not as abstract enemies, but as individuals. Edward Thompson, a wheat farmer from North Dakota who employed POW labor in 1944-45, later recalled, "They weren't what I expected. They were just young men, most of them. They worked hard, some harder than others, of course. After a while, you almost forgot they were supposed to be the enemy. They were just the help." For their part, many German prisoners were surprised by the relatively humane treatment they received. The Geneva Convention required that POWs be paid for their labor, and the American military deposited camp scrip, internal currency that could be used at camp canteens, into accounts for the working prisoners. The standard rate was 80 cents per day, approximately equivalent to the pay of an American private, minus expenses for their upkeep. This payment system created another revelation for many prisoners. Unlike in the German military, where rank rigidly determined privileges, in the POW camps, a private who worked diligently could accumulate more camp scrip than a non-working officer. This subtle exposure to American meritocratic values did not go unnoticed among the prisoners. The impact of these agricultural assignments extended beyond mere exposure to American abundance. The work also brought prisoners into contact with technological aspects of American farming that were still uncommon in Germany. Mechanized harvesters, industrial irrigation systems, and early application of scientific farming methods were eye-opening to men from a country where much farming was still done with horse-drawn equipment and manual labor. Hans Müller found himself assigned to a large wheat operation in Kansas that used combines to harvest fields that would have required dozens of men working for weeks in Germany. The farmer showed me how to operate a harvester that could do in hours what would take a whole village days to accomplish back home, he recounted years later. When I asked him how many of these machines existed, he laughed and said, "Every decent-sized farm has at least one." I didn't believe him until I saw for myself. The camps themselves became another venue for the prisoners to witness American abundance. According to the Geneva Convention, prisoners were entitled to the same rations as the soldiers guarding them. For men who had often subsisted on meager and irregular supplies at the front, the steady, nutritious meals in American POW camps seemed luxurious. Karl Weber, captured in Sicily in 1943, wrote home, "We eat better here than I ever did in the Wehrmacht. Meat almost every day, eggs, milk, vegetables, all in quantities that seem wasteful by German standards. I've gained back all the weight I lost in Africa, and then some. Mother, please don't worry about sending packages. We lack for nothing here." Such letters, heavily censored though they were, made their way back to Germany and contributed to declining morale on the home front. If captured soldiers were eating better than civilians or active troops, what did that say about Germany's prospects in the war? The exposure to American agricultural abundance had strategic implications beyond the individual experiences of the prisoners. Nazi leadership had based much of their war strategy on the assumption that democracies lacked the discipline and resources for a prolonged conflict. Seeing America's productive capacity firsthand gave many German officers cause to reevaluate this premise. Colonel Werner Schmidt, the highest-ranking officer at Camp Concordia in Kansas, noted in his private papers that were seized after the war, "What I've observed here has forced me to reconsider many fundamental assumptions. A system that produces such agricultural surplus while fighting globally possesses resources far beyond what our intelligence estimated. The American heartland alone could outproduce all of occupied Europe." Life in the POW camps varied considerably depending on location, camp administration, and the attitude of the prisoners themselves. The U.S. military initially separated prisoners based on their perceived political reliability. Confirmed Nazis were segregated from those deemed less ideologically committed. This policy acknowledged the reality that the prisoner population represented a cross-section of German society, from ardent Nazi supporters to those who had been conscripted and held little allegiance to Hitler's regime. By 1944, the camp system had developed a structured approach to managing the growing prisoner population. Daily life followed a predictable routine. Reveille at 5:30 a.m., breakfast, work assignments from 7 a.m. until 4 p.m. for those employed on farms or in other approved labor, dinner at 6 p.m., and lights out at 10 p.m. Within these parameters, prisoners were granted substantial freedom to organize their own activities. Many camps developed rich internal cultures. Prisoners formed orchestras, theater groups, and sports teams. They established educational programs where those with specialized knowledge taught classes in everything from languages to engineering. Some camps produced their own newspapers, carefully monitored by American censors, but providing a creative outlet and information source for the population. Camp Hearn in Texas became known for its elaborate gardens, where prisoners recreated traditional German landscaping designs. At Fort Robinson in Nebraska, artistically inclined POWs painted murals on the mess hall walls. These creative endeavors served as psychological lifelines, providing meaning and purpose in the circumscribed world of captivity. Religious services were permitted and even encouraged by camp authorities, who recognized their stabilizing influence. Both Catholic and Protestant chaplains, often prisoners themselves, conducted regular services. For many prisoners, especially those struggling with the moral implications of their role in the war, these religious gatherings provided crucial spiritual support. The American authorities also instituted re-education programs, though these were approached with deliberate subtlety. Rather than overt propaganda, the programs focused on exposing prisoners to American media, literature, and educational films. Libraries were stocked with books that had been banned in Nazi Germany, particularly works by German authors who had fled the regime. Many prisoners encountered for the first time the writings of Thomas Mann, Erich Maria Remarque, and other exiled German intellectuals. Hans Gärtner, a former Hitler Youth leader captured in France after D-Day, later described how his political views slowly transformed. "They never directly told us our beliefs were wrong. They just made available information that contradicted what we had been taught. I remember reading American newspapers that reported German defeats our propaganda had claimed as victories. At first, I thought it was American lies, but as the evidence accumulated month after month, I began to question everything I had been told. The rural communities surrounding the camps had complex relationships with the German prisoners. Initial apprehension often gave way to pragmatic cooperation as the economic benefits of prisoner labor became apparent. In many farming communities, the POWs quite literally saved the harvest, picking crops that would otherwise have rotted in the fields due to labor shortages. This economic necessity created unexpected social interactions. While official regulations prohibited fraternization between prisoners and civilians, the reality of daily agricultural work made such rules difficult to enforce. Farmers and their families worked alongside prisoners, shared meals, and inevitably developed personal connections that transcended the official enemy designation. In some communities, these relationships became controversial. When a farmer's wife in Minnesota was seen chatting and laughing with POWs working her family's fields, neighbors reported her for fraternization with the enemy. The local sheriff investigated, but ultimately concluded they're just talking about farming methods. Besides, how are they supposed to get the work done without communicating? Such pragmatic attitudes prevailed in many rural areas where the contributions of POW labor were too significant to be undermined by strict adherence to non-fraternization policies. In California's agricultural valleys, German prisoners picked fruits and vegetables crucial to the domestic food supply. In the cotton fields of the South, they replaced labor lost to northern industrial migration. In the wheat fields of the Great Plains, they operated machinery that might otherwise have sat idle. Children often formed the most direct connections with the prisoners. Farm kids whose fathers were frequently overseas fighting sometimes found surrogate paternal figures in the German men working their family lands. Elizabeth Weber of Oklahoma recalled in a 1990 oral history interview, "I was 10 years old and my father was fighting in the Pacific. Every morning, 3 German prisoners would come to work on our farm. One of them, Heinrich, would carve little wooden toys for me when they took their lunch break. My mother was wary at first, but eventually she would invite them to eat on our porch instead of sitting in the sun. They were polite, worked hard, and seemed grateful for the small kindnesses. It made me realize that the enemy was just people, not monsters." This humanization worked both ways. For many German soldiers indoctrinated with Nazi racial theories and propaganda about American decadence, daily interaction with ordinary American farm families provided powerful counter-evidence. They saw families working together, communities supporting one another, and a social system that, while far from perfect, functioned without the totalitarian control they had known in Germany. Walter Berger, who worked on dairy farms in Wisconsin, wrote after the war, "What impressed me most was not just the material wealth, though that was shocking enough. It was the casual freedom with which people spoke and acted. Farmers would openly criticize their government, debate policies, argue about the war's conduct, all without fear. This was unimaginable in Germany. I began to understand that a society could function, even thrive, without an iron fist directing it." As 1944 progressed and Allied victories mounted in Europe, the mood in many POW camps shifted. News of German defeats filtered in through officially provided newspapers and radio broadcasts. While some prisoners dismissed these reports as propaganda, the accumulating evidence of Germany's deteriorating position became difficult to ignore. The December 1944 Battle of the Bulge represented Germany's last major offensive, and its failure precipitated a noticeable decline in morale among even the most dedicated Nazi supporters in the camps. For many prisoners, this military reality, combined with their first-hand experience of American agricultural and industrial capacity, led to a profound reassessment. They had seen with their own eyes that the United States possessed resources that Germany could never match. The endless fields of grain, the mechanized farming operations, the well-fed population, even amid wartime rationing, all contradicted the Nazi narrative of American weakness. Fritz Engelhardt, a lieutenant captured in North Africa, expressed this realization in a letter permitted through censorship to his brother, also a POW, but held in a different camp. What we see here makes it clear why we cannot win this war. It is not just a matter of military strength, but of productive capacity. America's farms alone produce more than all of our conquered territories combined. We were misled about the true nature of our enemy's resources. This growing awareness created difficult psychological adjustments for many prisoners. Those who had genuinely believed in Nazi ideology faced a profound crisis of faith. Others, who had simply been following orders or had been conscripted against their will, found a sense of relief in acknowledging Germany's inevitable defeat, even as they worried about the fate of their homeland and families. By early 1945, as news of Allied advances into Germany itself reached the camps, authorities noted a significant shift in prisoner attitudes. Reports from camp commanders indicated a decline in disciplinary problems and increasing cooperation with work programs. Many prisoners, recognizing that they would eventually return to a defeated Germany, began to focus on learning skills that might prove useful in the post-war reconstruction. Agricultural knowledge became particularly valued. Prisoners requested and received books on modern farming techniques, soil conservation, and mechanized agriculture. Study groups formed to discuss how American methods might be adapted to German conditions after the war. This practical focus on the future represented both an acceptance of Germany's defeat and a determination to contribute to its eventual recovery. The American military, recognizing this shift, expanded educational opportunities in the camps. Classes in English language, American history, and democratic governance were offered alongside practical vocational training. While attendance was voluntary, records indicate high participation rates as 1945 progressed. The sudden news of President Roosevelt's death on April 12, 1945, created an unexpected moment of connection between captors and captives. Many German prisoners, even those who had considered Roosevelt an enemy, respected his leadership and were uncertain about what his passing meant for them. In several camps, prisoners asked permission to lower their flags to half-staff as a gesture of respect. At Camp Algona in Iowa, the German POW newspaper published a respectful obituary for Roosevelt, noting, "Whatever our differences with his policies, we recognize the passing of a great statesman whose vision helped shape the world we will all inhabit after this conflict ends." Such gestures reflected the evolving perspective of many prisoners as the reality of Germany's defeat became undeniable. The news of Hitler's suicide on April 30, 1945, followed by Germany's unconditional surrender on May 8, marked the definitive end of the conflict that had brought these men to American shores. The reactions among prisoners varied dramatically. Some dedicated Nazis refused to believe the reports and maintained that secret weapons or last-minute strategies would still deliver German victory. Others openly celebrated, revealing anti-Nazi sentiments they had kept hidden throughout their captivity. For the majority, however, the overwhelming emotion was concern for their families and homeland. Letters from Germany had become increasingly rare as the postal system collapsed in the war's final months. Many prisoners had no idea if their loved ones had survived the bombing campaigns or the Soviet advance. The American authorities, recognizing this humanitarian concern, worked to provide what information they could. The Red Cross established systems to trace family members, though the chaos in post-war Germany made this process slow and often frustrating. Camp newspapers published what information was available about conditions in specific German regions, helping prisoners from those areas gauge the situation their families might be facing. With the European war's end, the status of the German POWs in America changed significantly. They were no longer enemies in an active conflict, but prisoners awaiting repatriation to a defeated nation under Allied occupation. This transition created new uncertainties. How quickly would they be sent home? What would they find when they arrived? How would their time in America affect their reintegration into German society? As these questions hung in the air, the agricultural work programs continued through the summer and fall of 1945. The war's end had not resolved America's labor shortages, and the prisoners' contributions remained economically vital. In fact, some American farmers, having come to rely on this labor source, expressed concern about losing the POW workers before harvests were complete. For Hans Müller, like thousands of his fellow prisoners, the summer of 1945 brought a strange limbo. The war was over, but his captivity continued. As he worked in the Kansas wheat fields that August, helping bring in a harvest that would feed not only Americans, but also hungry populations in war-ravaged Europe, including his own countrymen, he reflected on the ironies of his situation. "I came to America as an enemy," he later wrote, "but I will leave having participated in feeding my own defeated people. The wheat I am harvesting today may become bread for my family in Bavaria." This is a strange war indeed, where the captured end up contributing to the welfare of those they left behind. This recognition of interconnection, that the American agricultural abundance he had first viewed with such shock would now help sustain a hungry post-war Germany, represented a profound shift in perspective that many prisoners experienced. The fields that had once symbolized American power now represented hope for Germany's recovery. As 1945 drew to a close and repatriation planning accelerated, prisoners and their American hosts faced the imminent reality of parting. For some, this prospect brought relief, a chance to finally return home and rebuild their lives. For others, particularly those who had formed connections in America or who feared the conditions in occupied Germany, the future seemed fraught with new uncertainties. What none could deny was that their time in America had changed them. They had arrived as soldiers of a regime that demonized the United States as a mongrelized, Jewish-controlled plutocracy doomed to failure. They would return having seen firsthand the productive capacity, technological advancement, and social cohesion that had contributed to America's victory. Perhaps most significantly, they had experienced an alternative to the authoritarian system they had left behind. Whatever their political views, they had lived in a society where farmers could openly criticize their government, where economic opportunity seemed available to ordinary people, and where abundance rather than scarcity shaped daily life. These experiences would travel with them back across the Atlantic, seeds of a different understanding planted alongside the crops they had harvested in America's heartland. As winter approached and the first groups of prisoners prepared for repatriation, Hans Müller received news that his request to be sent to Bavaria, where he hoped his family had survived, had been approved. On his last day of farm work, the Kansas farmer he had worked alongside for nearly 2 years shook his hand and said simply, "Good luck over there. Remember what you've seen here." "I will never forget it," Müller replied, looking out over the harvested fields stretching to the horizon. "This land taught me more than I ever expected to learn in captivity." The next morning, as he boarded the truck that would take him to the train station, the first step in his long journey home, Müller carried with him not just memories, but a transformed understanding of both America and his own country's place in the world. The golden cage that had once represented his defeat now seemed more like an unexpected window into a possible future, one where Germany too might someday achieve prosperity through production rather than conquest. As the truck pulled away from the camp, Müller watched America's heartland scroll past one last time. The winter wheat was already sprouting in the fields, the next year's harvest taking root, while this year's grain was feeding millions across the ocean. It was, he thought, perhaps the most powerful weapon America had possessed all along, the ability to grow rather than destroy, to produce rather than conquer. The systematic repatriation of German POWs from the United States began in earnest in the spring of 1946, though some transfers had started in late 1945. The process was complicated by several factors: the physical devastation of Germany's infrastructure, the division of the country into occupation zones, and the continuing need for labor in both America and Europe. The United States government, balancing humanitarian concerns with practical considerations, developed a phased approach to repatriation. Priority was given to prisoners with specialized skills needed for German reconstruction, those with verifiable family hardships, and those deemed most thoroughly denazified. This last category reflected a growing recognition that the returning prisoners could either support or undermine the nascent democratization efforts in occupied Germany. For Hans Müller and thousands like him, the journey home began with a train ride to East Coast ports, where they boarded Liberty ships similar to those that had brought them to America years earlier. The contrast between their arrival as defeated enemies and their departure was stark. Many prisoners had gained weight, acquired new skills, and developed a more nuanced understanding of the world beyond Germany's borders. The voyage across the Atlantic provided time for reflection. Walter Schmidt, returning to what was now the American occupation zone, recorded in his journal, "We are sailing toward an uncertain future in a homeland that may be unrecognizable. Yet I feel strangely prepared. 3 years ago, I knew only what the party taught us. Now I have seen another way of organizing society, another relationship between government and people, between farmers and their land." This knowledge feels dangerous, but essential. Arrival in Europe brought the first shocking confrontation with the war's aftermath. The ports were still surrounded by bomb damage, with cranes and warehouses operating amid rubble. For many prisoners, this was their first glimpse of the physical destruction their country had suffered. The contrast with the intact American landscape they had just left could not have been more dramatic. From the ports, the former prisoners were transported to central processing centers in their respective occupation zones. Here they underwent final screening by Allied authorities before being issued discharge papers and a small stipend for their journey home. Many received their first detailed information about specific conditions in their hometowns or villages, sometimes learning of family deaths or displacements that had occurred during their absence. The reception that awaited the returning POWs varied considerably. In some communities, they were welcomed as long-lost sons and husbands whose survival was cause for celebration amid so much loss. In others, particularly areas suffering severe food shortages, they faced resentment for having been well-fed in America, while civilians starved. This complex homecoming forced many former prisoners to carefully consider how much to share about their American experiences. For those returning to rural areas, the agricultural knowledge they had gained in America took on immediate practical importance. Germany's farming capacity had been severely compromised by the war. Fields had been abandoned as farmers were drafted. Agricultural equipment had been requisitioned for military purposes or destroyed in fighting, and draft animals had been confiscated or killed. The returning POWs often became important resources for rebuilding local agricultural systems. Friedrich Weber, who had worked on mechanized farms in Nebraska, found himself appointed as an agricultural advisor in his Bavarian district. The American authorities recognized that I had learned modern farming methods and asked me to help implement similar approaches here, he wrote to his former employer in Nebraska. It is difficult with so few machines and so little fuel, but the principles of soil management and crop rotation I learned from you are already improving our yields. Such technology and knowledge transfer represented an unexpected legacy of the POW labor program. Men who had been sent to America as prisoners returned as informal ambassadors of agricultural modernization. Many maintained correspondence with their former American employers, who sometimes sent seeds, technical advice, or even used farm equipment to help with German reconstruction. The most profound impacts of the POW experience, however, were often psychological and philosophical rather than technical. Men who had lived under National Socialism's totalitarian control had experienced a democratic society during their formative years. While not all were converted to American political ideals, most returned with a broader perspective that influenced their participation in post-war German society. Kurt Meyer, who had been a committed Nazi Party member before his capture, described his transformation. In Germany, we were taught that democracy was chaos, that only strong central authority could create order and prosperity. In America, I saw a different reality, a society that functioned through consensus rather than command, that produced abundance without forced labor camps, that allowed criticism without sending critics to prison. This did not make me an American, but it made me question everything I had believed about governance. Such reconsiderations became particularly significant as Germany began rebuilding its political institutions. In the Western occupation zones where democratic governance was being established, former POWs from America often became active participants in local politics, joining newly formed political parties and supporting democratic reforms. A 1947 survey conducted by American occupation authorities found that former POWs who had spent significant time in the United States showed higher rates of democratic participation and lower support for authoritarian alternatives than comparable veterans who had been held in other Allied countries. While correlation is not causation, these findings suggest that the American experience had a measurable impact on political attitudes. This political influence was not universal. Some returned prisoners, particularly those who had been ardent Nazis, maintained their ideological commitments despite their American experiences. Others, faced with the harsh realities of occupied Germany, became cynical about all political systems. The majority, however, seem to have integrated their observations of American society into a more nuanced worldview that influenced their approach to Germany's reconstruction. Beyond politics, the returnees brought back changed perspectives on race, religion, and social organization. Many had encountered American diversity firsthand, working alongside African Americans, Mexican Americans, and other groups demonized by Nazi racial ideology. While prejudices were not automatically erased, the direct experience often contradicted the stereotypes they had been taught. Friedrich Holtzman, who had worked on a California farm with Mexican-American laborers, reflected, "The party told us that racial mixing produced degeneracy and weakness. But these men worked harder than anyone I had ever seen, supporting families and building communities while sending sons to fight in the American Army. It made me question everything I had been told about race. If they were lying about this, what else was propaganda?" Religious perspectives also evolved through the POW experience. Many camps had active religious programs, with both Protestant and Catholic services available. Some prisoners who had distanced themselves from religion under the Nazi regime, which had an ambivalent and sometimes hostile relationship with traditional Christianity, reconnected with their faith traditions while in America. Joseph Lehman, a former Hitler Youth member who had embraced Nazi neo-paganism, described attending Catholic services in his Texas POW camp. "At first, I went just to break the monotony, but over time, the familiar rituals reconnected me to my childhood faith." The American chaplain never talked politics, just human fallibility and divine mercy. This seemed radical after years of hearing that strength was the only virtue and weakness the only sin. Upon returning to Germany, many former POWs became active in religious congregations, which were among the few intact social institutions in the immediate post-war period. Churches provided both practical assistance and moral guidance for communities struggling to process the war's devastation and Germany's responsibility for its atrocities. The reintegration of returned prisoners into family life presented yet another challenge. Many had left as young men and returned as mature adults with transformative experiences their families could not fully comprehend. Wives had managed households alone for years, children had grown up with absent fathers, and family dynamics had evolved in ways that could not simply revert to pre-war patterns. Hans Müller, reunited with his wife and the daughter who had been an infant when he was captured, discovered this complexity firsthand. Maria had become accustomed to making all decisions, managing our small farm, dealing with occupation authorities. She had grown stronger and more independent, while I had also changed. We had to get to know each other again, not just resume where we had left off. Such renegotiations of family roles were taking place across Germany, but the returned American POWs brought additional complications. They had witnessed alternative family structures and gender roles in the U.S., where women had entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers during the war. Some returned with more egalitarian expectations, while others, confronted with changed family dynamics, insisted on reasserting traditional authority. For children, the return of fathers who were virtual strangers created particular challenges. Klaus Weber was 7 when his father returned from an Iowa POW camp. This man came home with strange ideas and expressions, sometimes using English words we didn't understand. He would tell us about America, huge farms, everyone owning automobiles, children drinking milk every day. My mother would signal him to stop, worrying these stories made our own circumstances seem worse by comparison. Indeed, the contrast between American abundance and post-war German scarcity created significant psychological stress for many returnees. They had left a country that, despite wartime rationing, had maintained relatively stable living conditions for the civilian population through conquest and exploitation of occupied territories. They returned to a defeated nation where genuine hunger was common and basic necessities scarce. This contrast was particularly stark for those who had worked in American agriculture. They had harvested crops in quantities that seemed almost mythical by 1946 German standards, yet now they and their families subsisted on occupation rations that provided bare minimum nutrition. The knowledge that better conditions were possible made current hardships more difficult to accept passively. Fritz Neumann, who had worked on vegetable farms in California's Imperial Valley, expressed this frustration in a 1947 letter to his former American employer. "What troubles me most is knowing that the hunger here is unnecessary. I have seen how land can produce when properly managed with adequate resources. Now I watch our fields producing a fraction of their potential because we lack machinery, fertilizer, and organizational systems. This is not just nature's cruelty, but human failure." Such perspectives made former POWs both valuable resources for reconstruction efforts and sometimes uncomfortable critics of inefficiencies in the occupation administration. Their first-hand knowledge of American agricultural methods made them impatient with approaches they considered outdated or insufficient for addressing Germany's food crisis. American occupation authorities recognized this potential and established programs specifically targeting former POWs. The most ambitious was the German Agricultural Training Program, which identified former prisoners with farm experience and provided additional technical education before appointing them as local agricultural advisors. By 1948, over 3,000 former POWs were serving in such capacities across the American occupation zone. Their impact extended beyond technical advice. These men became cultural interpreters between occupation authorities and local farmers, explaining American approaches in terms that made sense within German agricultural traditions. This bridging function helped reduce resistance to innovations that might otherwise have been rejected as foreign impositions. Werner Schmidt, who served as an agricultural liaison in Württemberg, described this role. The American advisors would propose methods that seemed alien to our farmers, crop rotations unlike anything traditionally practiced here, unfamiliar varieties, new equipment. I could explain that I had seen these methods work in similar climates in America, but also help adapt them to our specific conditions and traditions. Neither side fully understood the other without such translation. As Germany's economic recovery accelerated, following the currency reform and Marshall Plan implementation in 1948, the agricultural knowledge brought back by former POWs contributed to a remarkable transformation of West German farming. Mechanization increased rapidly, fertilizer use expanded, and productivity rose dramatically. By the mid-1950s, West German agriculture had not only recovered from wartime devastation, but had begun a modernization process that would make it among the most efficient in Europe. This transformation was not attributable solely to returned POWs, of course. Marshall Plan aid, agricultural research, and broader economic policies all played crucial roles. Yet the human capital represented by farmers who had directly observed and participated in American agricultural methods accelerated the adoption and adaptation of these innovations within German contexts. Beyond agriculture, former POWs influenced post-war German society through their participation in business, education, and civic organizations. Many applied technical skills learned in America to Germany's industrial reconstruction. Others, who had taken advantage of educational opportunities in the camps, entered teaching professions with perspectives shaped by their American experiences. Helmut Keller had studied engineering through correspondence courses while at Camp Clarinda in Iowa. Upon his return to Stuttgart, he joined a manufacturing firm that was transitioning from military to civilian production. The Americans approached technical problems differently, he observed. There was less hierarchy, more willingness to try practical solutions rather than deferring to authority or tradition. I implemented similar approaches in our workshop, and productivity improved dramatically. Such transfers of organizational culture and management philosophy represented a subtler but perhaps more significant long-term influence than specific technical knowledge. Former POWs had observed American business practices during their work assignments and often returned with ideas about efficiency, employee relations, and customer service that differed from traditional German approaches. As West Germany's economic miracle gathered momentum in the 1950s, these alternative models of business organization became increasingly relevant. Companies seeking to compete in international markets were receptive to innovations that promised greater productivity and adaptability. Former POWs who had directly observed American industrial and agricultural methods often found themselves valued for this experience as West German businesses sought to modernize. The cultural impact extended to consumer expectations and lifestyle aspirations. Men who had experienced American material abundance often returned with changed perspectives on consumption, housing standards, and leisure. While immediate post-war conditions made such aspirations seem remote as recovery progressed, these changed expectations influenced West German society's embrace of consumer culture. Karl-Heinz Weber had worked in a camp canteen in Texas, where even prisoners had access to products that had been luxuries in wartime Germany: chocolate, cigarettes, coffee, and canned goods in varieties he had never seen. I returned with a different idea of what normal life could include, he recalled in a 1970s interview. Not just necessities, but small pleasures, conveniences, choices. When our economy began to improve, I wanted these things for my family, this American standard of living. This orientation toward consumer comfort and convenience, while not unique to former POWs, was reinforced by their first-hand experience of American abundance. As West Germany recovered economically, many embraced a vision of prosperity that included elements they had first encountered during their captivity: household appliances, ready-made clothing, processed foods, and leisure activities. The personal connections formed during the POW experience also created lasting transnational ties. Despite official regulations against fraternization, many prisoners had developed relationships with their American employers that continued through correspondence after repatriation. These connections sometimes led to business partnerships, educational exchanges, or simply enduring friendships that bridged the former enemy status. Farmer Edward Miller from Minnesota maintained contact with 3 German POWs who had worked on his farm during 1944-45. In the early 1950s, when one of them established an agricultural equipment business in Bavaria, Miller helped facilitate connections with American manufacturers. They weren't enemies anymore, Miller's son later recalled. They were just people my father had worked with who needed help rebuilding their lives. Such personal diplomacy, multiplied across thousands of similar connections, created informal channels for reconciliation and exchange that operated alongside official foreign policy. Former POWs who maintained American contacts often became local resources for information about the United States, counterbalancing lingering propaganda stereotypes with their personal experiences. The Cold War's onset added another dimension to the former POWs' influence. As tensions between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union transformed former enemies into new allies, West German society underwent a rapid geopolitical reorientation. Former prisoners who had direct experience of American society often became advocates for Western alignment, particularly in comparison to those returning from Soviet captivity with stories of harsh treatment and deprivation. This contrast became particularly evident in divided Germany. While precise numbers are difficult to establish, historical estimates suggest that approximately 75% of the German POWs held in America were eventually repatriated to what became West Germany, with the remainder returning to the Soviet occupation zone that would become East Germany. This created a natural experiment in the differing impacts of captivity experiences on post-war development. Former prisoners returning to the Soviet zone encountered a political system that viewed their American experience with suspicion. Rather than being valued for their knowledge, they were often marginalized as potentially contaminated by capitalist influences. Some faced explicit discrimination in employment and educational opportunities based on their Western captivity. Otto Schmidt returned to his home in Saxony, which fell under Soviet control, after 2 years on a Nebraska farm. When authorities learned I had been a prisoner in America, I immediately became suspect, he recalled after fleeing to West Germany in 1952. They questioned me repeatedly about what indoctrination I had received, what contacts I maintained with Americans. My applications for university study were rejected. Eventually, I understood there was no future for me there with this American connection in my past. In contrast, West German society and occupation authorities generally viewed American POW experience as neutral or even positive. Former prisoners could reference their time in the United States on job applications without fear of discrimination, and many found that employers valued their English language skills and familiarity with American methods. This divergence in reception reinforced the broader separation of the two Germanys along Cold War lines. Former American POWs in West Germany often became personally invested in the Western Alliance, having experienced aspects of American society firsthand. Those in East Germany generally learned to minimize or conceal their American experiences to avoid political complications. As Cold War tensions solidified, the former POWs' American connections took on additional significance. When West Germany began re-establishing military forces through the Bundeswehr in 1955, former Wehrmacht officers were needed to provide leadership and training. Those who had been American POWs were often considered particularly suitable, as they were seen as less likely to harbor extreme nationalist or militarist views and more likely to adapt to NATO integration. General Johannes Steinhoff, who rose to high command in the Bundeswehr and later NATO, had been held at a POW camp in Rhode Island. He credited his American experience with broadening his perspective. In captivity, I met American officers who approached military matters differently than our German tradition dictated. More pragmatic, less rigid, more focused on individual initiative. These observations influenced my approach to building a democratic military that could defend West Germany without threatening its neighbors. The educational impact of the POW experience extended to families and communities. Children of former prisoners grew up hearing stories about America that differed from both Nazi-era propaganda and post-war Soviet narratives. These personal accounts, whatever their individual content, added complexity to public perceptions of the United States during a period when simplified Cold War imagery dominated official discourse. Maria Hoffman, whose father had worked on California farms as a POW, recalled, "Father's America was neither the perfect paradise of official West German gratitude nor the imperialist villain of East German propaganda. It was a real place with real people he had known, farmers who treated him decently, guards who enforced rules but weren't cruel, a society that impressed him with its productivity but also puzzled him with its contradictions. His stories gave me a more human picture than any official version." Such nuanced personal narratives, shared within families and communities, contributed to West Germany's complex relationship with American influence. Neither uncritical embrace nor reflexive rejection, but a selective adaptation that became characteristic of post-war German development. By the mid-1950s, as West Germany achieved sovereignty and economic recovery accelerated, the distinct identity of former American POWs began to fade into broader veteran experiences. Veterans organizations generally did not distinguish between members based on where they had been captured or held. The shared experience of wartime service and post-war reintegration transcended the specificities of captivity, yet informal networks persisted. Former POWs from the same camps occasionally organized reunions, and some maintained group correspondence with American communities where they had worked. These connections provided continued channels for personal diplomacy and cultural exchange, even as the POW experience receded from public memory. As Cold War divisions hardened, official commemoration of the POW experience became politically complicated. East German narratives emphasized the suffering of German prisoners in Western captivity, while West German accounts highlighted the relatively humane conditions in American camps, particularly in comparison to Soviet treatment of German prisoners. Neither approach fully captured the complexity of individual experiences or the lasting impact of cultural exchange. The human story of transformation exemplified by men like Hans Müller largely disappeared from public discourse, subsumed into broader narratives of war, defeat, and reconstruction. Individual memories remained, shared within families or small communities, but rarely entered mainstream historical consciousness. This historiographical neglect began to change in the 1970s, as a new generation of scholars in both Germany and the United States approached the POW experience with fresh questions. Moving beyond earlier concerns with legal treatment and repatriation policies, these researchers became interested in the cultural impact of the prisoner experience, how it had shaped individuals and, through them, post-war society. Oral history projects documented the recollections of aging former prisoners, preserving their experiences before they were lost to time. Archives that had been closed for security reasons became available to researchers, revealing the extent and impact of POW labor programs. The agricultural dimension received particular attention as scholars recognized its significance both economically and symbolically. Hans Müller participated in one such oral history project in 1977 at age 62. The interviewer asked what had most surprised him about America. "The relationship between people and land," he answered without hesitation. "In Germany, land was identity, history, something you defended or conquered. In America, land was possibility, productivity, something you developed and made fruitful. This difference explains so much about why we went to war and why we lost." This insight captured a fundamental contrast that many former prisoners had observed between a European worldview where land represented fixed, zero-sum value tied to national identity and an American perspective where land represented developmental potential and productive capacity. The endless fields that had so shocked arriving prisoners embodied not just material abundance, but a different conceptual relationship between society and territory. As scholars incorporated such perspectives into historical analysis, the POW experience gained recognition as a significant channel of cultural transfer between wartime enemies. The approximately 372,000 German prisoners who had spent time in America represented one of the largest groups to experience direct, sustained exposure to American society during a formative historical period. Their return to a devastated Germany where everything had to be rebuilt, politically, economically, socially, created conditions where their American experiences could influence Reconstruction choices. The aggregate impact of these individual influences is impossible to quantify precisely, but appears significant in areas ranging from agricultural modernization to business organization to democratic participation. The 1980s brought renewed interest in the POW story as German-American relations entered a new phase following German reunification. Museums in both countries developed exhibitions documenting the camps and their legacy. Communities where camps had been located began preserving remaining structures and commemorating this chapter of local history. Former prisoners, now elderly, sometimes returned to visit the places of their captivity, often accompanied by children and grandchildren curious about this chapter of family history. American communities frequently welcomed these visits, organizing receptions that symbolically closed the circle from enemy captivity to reconciled friendship. Johann Weber, who had spent 2 years at Camp Algona in Iowa, returned in 1992 with his son and grandson. The local historical society organized a gathering where he met children of the farmers he had worked for nearly 5 decades earlier. "This was once my prison," he told a local newspaper reporter, "but it became my university. What I learned here shaped everything that came after, how I farmed, how I raised my family, how I understood the world." Such personal reconciliations mirrored the broader German-American relationship, which had evolved from wartime enmity through Cold War alliance to post-reunification partnership. The former POWs had experienced this full arc of transformation, from firing at American troops to working on American farms to becoming advocates for transatlantic cooperation. Their story gained renewed relevance as the Cold War ended, and questions of national reconciliation after conflict resurfaced in global politics. The German-American experience offered a case study in how former enemies could move beyond wartime hostility to productive cooperation, with the POW exchanges representing an early, unplanned experiment in cultural diplomacy and perspective transformation. Historians noted that the successful reintegration of German POWs contrasted with many other post-conflict scenarios where returning prisoners became vectors of continued grievance and renewed conflict. The difference appeared to lie partly in the nature of the captivity experience itself, not merely its relative physical comfort, but its provision of alternative models for social and economic organization that prisoners could apply in post-war reconstruction. This insight informed approaches to prisoner treatment in subsequent conflicts, with emphasis on not merely meeting minimum humanitarian standards, but creating conditions where prisoners could develop perspectives conducive to post-conflict reconciliation. While never perfectly implemented, this principle represented an important legacy of the World War II POW experience. As the last generation with direct World War II experience began to pass from the scene in the early 21st century, the POW story transitioned from living memory to documented history. Archival collections preserved letters, diaries, photographs, and oral histories that would allow future generations to study this unique instance of enemy captivity transformed into cultural exchange. The agricultural dimension remained particularly significant. As global food security emerged as a major 21st century concern, the historical example of agricultural knowledge transfer through the POW program offered insights into how productive techniques could cross cultural and political boundaries, even in contexts of conflict. In 2015, a German-American research project using advanced GIS mapping identified thousands of farms where German POWs had worked during 1943-45. Overlaying this data with agricultural productivity statistics revealed that many of these areas had experienced above-average increases in yield and efficiency in the immediate post-war decades. While correlation is not causation, This pattern suggested that the knowledge transfer facilitated by the POW labor program had measurable long-term impacts. For Hans Müller's family, the American connection had become integral to their identity across generations. His daughter Maria, born just before his deployment and raised after his return from America, recalled how his experiences had shaped their family farm. Father implemented techniques he learned in Kansas, contour plowing to prevent erosion, crop rotation sequences he had never seen in Bavaria, machinery modifications that improved efficiency. Our neighbors thought he was strange at first, but when our yields improved, they began to ask questions and adopt similar methods. Maria's son, Johann, continued the family's agricultural tradition, but with modern education, his grandfather could never have imagined earning an agricultural science degree and studying for a semester at Kansas State University, a connection facilitated by his grandfather's correspondence with his former American employer's family. Grandfather always said that the most powerful weapon America had wasn't something that destroyed, but something that created, Johann reflected. He meant their agricultural abundance, their ability to produce more than they needed and share it with others. This idea shaped his life after the war and our family's approach to farming ever since. This generational continuity of influence exemplified how the POW experience had rippled through time, creating legacies that extended far beyond the immediate post-war period. What had begun as a pragmatic solution to wartime labor shortages and prisoner housing challenges had produced unintended consequences that helped shape German-American relations for decades to follow. The story of German POWs encountering America's agricultural abundance illustrates a broader historical pattern. How wartime experiences often produce unforeseen influences that outlast the conflict itself. The transfer of agricultural knowledge, management approaches, and even philosophical perspectives about land use and productivity demonstrated how cultural exchange continues even when formal diplomacy is suspended. For individuals like Hans Müller, the POW experience represented a personal inflection point, a forced journey that became transformative. The Kansas wheat fields, where he had initially seen evidence of American power, ultimately offered something more valuable, a vision of prosperity built on production rather than conquest, on development rather than domination. This vision did not erase the horrors of the war or absolve responsibility for Germany's aggression, nor did it represent an uncritical embrace of all things American. Rather, it offered a practical alternative pathway for rebuilding a shattered society, one focused on creating abundance rather than fighting over scarcity. As the 21st century progresses and new global challenges emerge, the story of the German POWs in America's heartland offers enduring lessons about reconciliation, knowledge transfer, and the power of direct experience to transform perspective. Beyond the military outcome of World War II, this unplanned experiment in cross-cultural exposure helped lay foundations for a more cooperative international order. Johann Müller, speaking at a 2010 conference on German-American relations, summarized his grandfather's legacy. He came to America as an enemy soldier and left as an informal agricultural ambassador. The fields that first showed him why Germany could not win the war later showed him how Germany could successfully rebuild. This transformation, multiplied across thousands of returning prisoners, helped create the conditions for lasting peace between former enemies. In American farming communities where the POWs had worked, memories also persisted. County historical societies preserved photographs, work records, and correspondence between former prisoners and local families. Museums in towns like Algona, Iowa, and Crossville, Tennessee, developed exhibitions documenting this unexpected chapter of local history. Martha Johnson, whose family farm in Minnesota had employed German prisoners, donated letters they had received from their Germans for decades after the war. "My parents never thought of them as the enemy, not really," she explained. They were just young men far from home who worked hard and learned quickly. The political divisions seem to fade away when you're working together to bring in a harvest before the rain comes. This ground-level reconciliation, based on shared labor and mutual respect, preceded and perhaps facilitated the official political alliance that would develop between West Germany and the United States during the Cold War. It represented people-to-people diplomacy at its most basic and effective level. As the final former POWs passed away in the early 21st century, their first-hand accounts were preserved through oral history projects, memoirs, and family records. The material traces of their time in America, photographs, craft items made in the camps, postcards, and letters, became valued artifacts in both personal collections and museum exhibitions. Their story, once a footnote in World War II history, gained recognition as a significant example of how human connections can develop even in the context of international conflict. The German POWs who worked American farms had been sent to the United States as a logistical solution to an immediate problem. They returned to Germany carrying seeds of transformation that would bear fruit for generations. The endless fields that had first appeared to Hans Müller as evidence of America's unbeatable productive capacity became, in retrospect, fields of reconciliation, spaces where former enemies worked side by side and began the long process of rebuilding not just agricultural systems, but the foundation for peaceful coexistence.